We've got some exciting presentations this afternoon. Excellent presentations on urban delivery strategies from the first ever all Doctor FIC panel. As Sophia mentioned, the NJTPA is just getting started on our e-commerce delivery mitigation study, which will be our last presentation this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce all our speakers first, and Sophia will manage the question and answer portion once the presentations conclude. Our first speaker is Dr. Giacomo Dalla Cara, Research Director of the Urban Freight Lab at the University of Washington, where he leads research on behavioral urban logistics, sustainable freight transportation, and data-driven approaches to improving access to goods and services in cities. Our second speaker is Dr. Farah Gizawi, who recently completed her doctorate in civil engineering at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on urban freight, curbside management, and the use of large-scale spatial data to modal travel and parking behaviors of commercial vehicles and evaluate emerging last-mile delivery solutions. Our last presenters will be Dr. Allison Conway and Dr. Branislav Dimitrievich, who are working on our e-commerce delivery mitigation study. Allison is a professor of civil engineering at the City College of New York and conducts research through CUNY University's Transportation Research Center. She is also an associate director of the Center for Understanding Future Travel Behavior and Demand and a US DOT designated National University Transportation Center. She works primarily in the areas of urban freight and city logistics and multimodal interactions in the urban environment. Branislav is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at NJIT, my alma mater, by the way, with more than 20 years of experience in transportation engineering, research, and education. He specializes in transportation systems analysis, transportation planning, traffic management and operations, and intelligent transportation systems, or ITS. His current research focuses on the use of integrated mobile observations in road weather management, applications of connected vehicle data in transportation systems management and operation, and AI models for traffic safety and analysis and prediction. So if Giacomo can please get us started, and then we will follow up with the other presentations. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my slide. Cool. Please let me know if you don't see my slides. But very nice to meet you all. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Giacomo Dalla Chiara. I am a senior research scientist at the Urban Freight Lab. And I will take about like 15, 20 minutes to present on a recent paper that we published together with my co-authors Yu-Chen Chu, Kylie Rula, Arsalan Ismaili, Brian Hamlin, Addison, and Anne Goodchild. The title of the presentation and the paper is Commercial Vehicle Load Zone Programs, so I will refer to as CVLZ programs in US cities. There is a work that is being in collaboration with the Open Mobility Foundation and has also been inspired by recent work that I've been doing with Allison Conway on to study the completeness, how freight and complete street kind of works together. So this is an NCHP project that we are just finishing right now. But this was partially inspired by that NCHP project, and it's really a review of on how different US cities allocate and manage free parking, mostly curb free parking. So let me get started. So this is how we, generally stereotypically represent the last mile, right? So we refer to the last mile as the last leg of, the delivery process, the supply chain process. From a distribution center, last mile delivery stations to the final customers and consumers. This could be households, for instance, like in package deliveries, or it could be restaurants for like fresh food deliveries and so on and so forth. A lot of my work has been, in the past 7 years, I would say, that I've been working in the Urban Freight Lab, is really put a lens on magnifying what happened at arrival. So when you arrive close to the customer, and what how delivery driver behaves, and all the parking behaviors around a destination. So it's really about, not only the parking, but accessing parking and accessing the delivery customer. We generally refer to this process as the last 50 feet. So really what happened around those like uh, black dots that you see that in the last mile delivery. So it starts with like identifying, suitable parking location, right? That could be, authorized parking or unauthorized parking, but still that involves some kind of search, and sometimes we call it like cruising for parking. Idling is a pretty big important part as well when delivery drivers wait for a time windows to open. And we refer to walking as the last part of like accessing from the parking to the customer locations, and as well like spending time handling the goods at the customer location and coming back to the vehicle. So we refer to this, processes of activities, sequence of activities as the last 50 feet. One thing that we found in past research is that the last 50 feet, um, delivery drivers spend most of their time in the last 50 feet exactly. So we've done a few studies here in Seattle and Stockholm, where we collected a large amount of GPS data from different companies from different sectors. In this case here, I'm showing parcel deliveries in US that was done in Seattle, GPS data from a beverage delivery company in Seattle as well. And we collaborated with a colleague of mine in Stockholm, in Sweden, where we analyze GPS data from a grocery delivery company and electric supply delivery companies. And what we've done, what we see here is 100% of a delivery driver time. So from the morning to the evening, how much a delivery driver time spent in each of those activities that I mentioned before. Walking is really like the last 50 feet. So like from the parking locations, to the customer, the time you spend at the customer. The driving is between stops, right? So all the links between the different delivery stops here. And then the cruising time is how much time you spend like in all parking related delays. And what we found is that, on average, most of a delivery driver time, so more than 50% is spent on the last 50 feet. So like in walking, walking to the customer, accessing the customer, spending time, doing the loading and unloading at the customer locations, but as well as cruising for parking and searching for parking. In Stockholm, the walking party accessing, so the dwell time it was around like 40%, plus the cruising was, above 50%. In Seattle metropolitan area, that was pretty high. We had an average of more than like 70% spent only just like walking, and around like 7 to 15% cruising for parking. So this to say that like the last 50 feet is an important part of a delivery process, but we don't know much about it. And even more, we don't account for it when we do routing of delivery vehicles in urban areas. And this is very important also because there is a lot of behavior that comes with the last 50 feet and infrastructure that we allow delivery drivers to use. These are different pictures. From the first one on the left is well, I took it from Singapore, where I did my PhD. The middle one was from Philadelphia, and the right one is from Seattle, in the US. So different context, different infrastructures available, but in a way, kind of like, and similar behaviors related to the last 50 feet. And in Singapore, there's very little curb parking, a lot of like off-street loading bays, but not enough. The infrastructure was built a long time ago, and so there's a lot of truck queuing, waiting for accessing the loading and unloading bays off-street. In the middle one is a typical photo that you might have seen in many US cities, where if we don't plan for, car parking for freight, there are unauthorized behaviors like the one we see here, blocking, in this case, like a bike lane, protect the bike lane. The other thing we noticed, first in Seattle and other behaviors is delivery drivers aggregating customers into a single stop. So like the delivery driver will spend a lot of time, park on the curb or middle lane while delivering to multiple customers and walking pretty long distances. So now, the question is, what can we do in terms of like from a planning infrastructure perspective? When we think about passenger transportation, we have pretty good ideas of like what infrastructure and policy can help us manage passenger parking and passenger demand. These are just some examples of like curb pricing. This is the ERP, the road pricing in Singapore. And what really motivated this study was what can we do, what happened from the freight side. So, and in particular, we were interested in understanding how cities are managing free parking. Um, we in this paper we introduce the concept, the term of commercial vehicle load zone program as a set of infrastructure, policy, and regulatory strategies the different cities adopt to manage commercial vehicle parking. Um, and I highlighted especially like it's a set of strategies. So it's not about just allocating curb parking to commercial vehicles. It's beyond that, is deciding also like where those parking are, and then who are, what is the definition of free vehicles? Who are the authorized users of those curb load zones? Do we want to price them? So all the policy related to load zone, those load zone programs and infrastructure, and as well how we regulate those, how we enforce it. What are the parking fines and fees? What is the maximum dwell time we allowed, and so on and so forth. So it's not only just allocating infrastructure, painting the curb yellow and creating load zones, but it's really like a holistic approach to manage curb parking for commercial vehicles. So their general research objectives is really like what are those infrastructure and policy and regulatory strategy the different cities in the US are adopting to manage free parking in urban areas. And we were curious to understand what are the similarities and differences. Is there an agreement of what works and what doesn't work? And lastly, from a research perspective, like is there a gap of like between what we study and what we propose and what cities are doing and implementing in terms of like urban free parking management. And eventually, this boils down like how can we integrate parking management strategies in our concept of completeness, sustainability, safety, vision zero, and so on and so forth. So really, how we integrate free parking management in planning. The paper is already published and is open source, so everyone can, is able to download it. If you have any questions, feel free to, I'll leave my email to the chat. Feel free to reach out. Briefly on the methodology, we selected several cities in the US. We have, I believe, around like 13 cities where we studied deep into their codes and policy, regulation, municipal codes, ordinances to understand what are different cities doing in terms of like what strategy they're adopting from infrastructure, policy, regulation perspective. And then we try to get as much data as possible that we could find from these cities, and that was a really hard part because there's not a lot of cities that are documenting and creating the layers of their curb infrastructures. So for those, we were able to find open source data on their curbs. We did some infrastructure analysis as well. So I'm gonna go the next 10 minutes across different results. So, comparing those commercial vehicle load zone programs. I'll start from a policy perspective, then go into regulation infrastructure. From a policy perspective, the first question is who are, the authorized users of load zones, right? So once you allocate and create that infrastructure for parking for commercial vehicles, who do you allow to park there? So it boils down to like, how do you define a freight vehicle or freight activity? Um, and already in the simple question in terms of like, who are the commercial vehicle users? Different cities have different approaches in defining freight activities and freight vehicles. A lot of cities define, freight, activities according, well, freight vehicles according, or freight users according to the physical characteristics of the vehicle. So some cities says like, well, it has to have a certain length or width or, certain number of wheels, gross weight thresholds as well. Presence of or non-presence of passenger windows and seats is also being used. We've seen that. Different vehicles, models of vehicles, and then display or not display of commercial logo and insignia. That was all characteristic to some cities use to define commercial vehicles. Some cities also says, well, a commercial vehicle is whatever the state, licensed to be a commercial vehicle. So they, but the problem with this approach is also that, it ends up basically equaling commercial vehicles being mostly only like heavy goods vehicles. And then some cities try to define commercial vehicles according to the activities they perform. So whether they load and unload any goods, freight or merchandise. Some cities allowed service vehicles to be part of commercial vehicles activities. Sometimes they're referred to as building and utility services. Some cities refer to car deliveries to refer to online deliveries, basically of food and groceries, for instance. And as well, some cities also allow for commercial passenger transportation to be considered commercial activities. So there's already a quite large variety of definitions of commercial activities across cities, and really, depending on boiling down to the questions like, do you, consider, vans and smaller vehicles doing load and load, for instance, do you consider those commercial activities and therefore authorized users of your, load and load zones and infrastructure you provide? Do you consider service vehicles part of those commercial activities? And what about like online deliveries? So when we go to, once you decide, who are your authorized users, then a lot of cities also start customizing, instead of having one type of load zones, they provide different physical infrastructure for different types of commercial activities. We try to come up with like a general typology of what we've seen in terms of like what are the type of load zones that cities allocate. We divided them in three subgroups. One on curb commercial spaces. So those are like spaces reserved only for, especially for commercial vehicles. Curb passenger spaces. Those are some cities allow for a mix of freight and passenger activities in some of those curb load zones. And then in some other cities, it allowed for non-curb spaces to be used for commercial activities. When we look at the curb commercial spaces, the classic is, the commercial load zones, so the most common and general commercial activities supporting general commercial activities. Some cities start distinguishing between general and truck load zones. Truck load zones are mostly for heavy goods vehicles. Those are located more in the industrial areas and suburban areas. Some cities, started different programs on what we call specialty load zones. For instance, in New York City, we have neighborhood load zones in residential areas supporting residential deliveries. In Seattle here, we have entertainment load zones for instance, music venues. There are like hotel load zones. I think in Portland, for a smart grant, they started the green load zone program, allowing only like zero emission vehicles to park there. Some cities are equipping those load zones with monitoring sensors, so then referring them to a smart load zone, so on and so forth. Then we have a whole series of general load zones that they mix. Some cities are mixing commercial vehicle activities with as well commercial passenger activities, so that include pickup, drop off, and as well some cities as well are allowing commercial vehicles to use paid parking areas. They're mostly for passenger activities, but also allowing them to be used by commercial activities. Finally, alleys, it's an important part of infrastructure that some cities in the US have. For instance, interesting in Miami Beach, alleys, commercial activities are allowed on alleys during the late morning and afternoons to not coincide with like waste management activities. And as well as some cities that are allowing for double parking and no parking zones under certain conditions. Very interesting. It's about pricing, right? So we have good amount of information and theories about how pricing work and how pricing affect behaviors of passenger vehicles. Here I'm talking about curb pricing. When we go from passenger to freight vehicles, we start having we don't have enough information like what is the impact of curb pricing on freight vehicles. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of cities implementing parking pricing for freight vehicles. There are three main approaches that we've seen. One are permit programs. This is the case for us in Seattle. where once you buy the permit as a fleet manager, as a company, and then you allow your delivery drivers to park in any of those load zones provided. Those permits usually last like a few months, 1 month, 6 months, or a year. Um, some cities allowing for pay-per-use, therefore similar to paid parking in passenger transportations. Also, freight vehicle would use the same, for instance, through mobile apps or parking stations. Very interesting. Some cities are charging not the drivers or fleet managers for parking, but they allowed only business establishment to pay for parking. What that means basically, our business establishment, they request for the creation of load zones. And therefore they pay for installations and then they pay an yearly fee for maintenance. So instead of, and you see here different types of commercial vehicle parking pricing have different users that pay for parking. The permit program is mostly fleet managers and the companies. When we talk about pay-per-use, and mostly drivers and as well fleet managers, if the driver pass on that the cost. But when we go to the installation maintenance are mostly business establishments and not the carriers. Um, this is just an example for us in Seattle. I've been working a lot with the Seattle Department of Transportation on their commercial vehicle loads and programs. It's one of the most historic and oldest, probably, commercial vehicle loads and program in the US, had been established back in 1989. It's a permits-based system. It's around $250 a year. And on average, they've seen around like 4,000 applicants of those permits over the years. Regulations are also very important. There are different types of infractions. There are, attached to load zones. One is the abuse of commercial permits. Therefore, you use the load zones that requires a permit, but you don't have it. Exceeding time limits. There are a lot of cities that impose those time limits. The most common is 30 minutes for parking, and as well like of the vehicles that don't have the permit or they are not commercial that use load zones. When we talk about the parking fines, they're in general pretty low compared to counterparts in Europe, for instance. It's mostly like a monetary fee, and it ranges between the minimum of like $30 to up to like 600 in Miami Beach. In terms of infrastructure, this is pretty hard to find data on curb allocation in different cities. Here and there's a huge diversity of the load zone networks that we've seen in different cities. It ranges from around like 80 load zones that we've seen in Minneapolis all the way to New York City. We have more than 1,000 load zones. In terms of kilometers or percentage of a portion of curb that is allocated to load zones, also pretty there's a high diversity going from like 0.1% of the allocated curb allocated to load zones vehicles to commercial vehicles to up to 10% of total allocated curb to commercial vehicles. One main thing is that allocation is most of the time ad hoc or done by request. For instance, if in the case of the establishments pay for those load zones instead of the carriers, they can request and allocate those. Only New York City have started has by legislation they have to come up with like a methodology to allocate those load zones in a more data-driven way. There are also different approaches in creating and developing that infrastructure. On the left side, for instance, you see Austin and Seattle. They concentrate most of the load zones in urban villages and downtowns while not covering residentials and other parts of the cities. Some cities like San Francisco and Miami Beach, they tend to try to cover larger areas, and the most extreme is New York City that has a more sparse and homogeneous approach in allocating those load zones, mostly because they are allow load zones to be in residential districts, those through their neighborhood load zones program. Few conclusions. So, we analyze, those 13 cities and their commercial vehicle load zone programs. We've seen, and all those cities are cities that already have load zones, they have infrastructure, they have policy and regulations, right? So we haven't really covered like what cities, the cities that do not, regulate for parking and allocate free parking infrastructure. We've seen a kind of like a maturity level of different cities, right? The first basic level is the recognition that commercial vehicle exists, that there are not enough off-street load and load zones, and therefore we need to preserve and allocate some of the curb to those vehicles, to those activities. So that's kind of like what we call like a foundational allocation of infrastructure. More advanced programs they start thinking of like, okay, there are different types of commercial activities that have different requirements and needs. So starting differentiating in terms of like different use types and therefore different types of load zones, all the way to active management, where we start monitoring, providing information, the reservation systems, and pricing as well, influencing really their last 50 feet behaviors. General, conclusions here. We did have a hard time finding data, and then, general lack of data, and as well like a standardization of that. And that's a lot of work that has been done by the Open Mobility Foundation to create a standard for, for the curb and understanding the curb and, digitizing the curb. We don't really have a universal CVZ programs, right? And definitely we don't necessarily need one. Different cities have different contexts and different urban forms, so therefore it makes sense that they are different from each other. But at the same time, we've seen a lot of experimentation and uncertainty in what works, what doesn't work, with little knowledge sharing, which it creates a kind of like a problem because each city they started different pilots, but they are not able to see what is succeeded, what doesn't succeed in other cities. Definitely, we have no clear understanding or definition of what is commercial vehicles, what are commercial vehicles, and what are commercial vehicle activities. And as well, there's little involvement of the final three stakeholders in creation and allocation of that infrastructure. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Again, feel free to reach out. And if you want more information, details on each of those programs, feel free to download that paper. Is open source. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And we're going to have questions at the end. So we are going to move on to our second speaker, Dr. Farah Ghizawi. The floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you. Okay, I hope you all hear me all right. Good
Yep.
afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm just gonna turn off my video to save some bandwidth, and I'm gonna share my slides.
Ara,
Oh, okay.
you don't
I
need
think
to
you're
share
already.
you don't need to share your
Good.
slides. I
Perfect,
got it.
perfect.
I got it. And
All
again,
right.
apologies for the trouble. Just
No worries.
for everybody on the line. Apparently Zoom was set up with some kind of a restriction, so Farah was unable to join from Canada, but she managed to bypass that somehow. So thank you, Farah, and please go ahead.
Yeah, I basically connected to a VPN. That's what I did to bypass the geographic restrictions.
Appreciate it.
Just in time.
Thank you.
No worries at all. Thank you. I guess you will be flipping the moving with the slides, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, my name is Farah, and I'm presenting on behalf of Professor Matthew Ruda and our research team from the University of Toronto. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through a pilot project that we ran here in downtown Toronto in partnership with Purolator, which is a leading courier company, where they replaced traditional light-duty box trucks with electric cargo tricycles operating from one small neighborhood microhub that it's similar to the concept of an urban consolidation center with a twist, I would say. And then I'll share with you what we measured operationally and environmentally, and then make the case back by a citywide formal optimization model, and what would it take to bring this approach to the rest of the city, as well to other cities with similar contexts, I would say. So next slide, please. So before I get into the findings, I want to acknowledge the partners who made this work possible. So the pilot itself was delivered in partnership with Purelator and the City of Toronto, and it was funded by the Purelator Research Chair, the City and the Region of Peel, as well as the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. We did get a lot of telematic data from Geotab also, which supply telematic devices to Purelator. And then I think our project team is based at the University of Toronto, and that's part of the Smart Freight Center. And this pilot was part of the CLUE initiative. Next slide, please. So I'll structure the presentation as you see in this slide. So I'll start with why it matters, answering the question of I think the broader freight and climate context that motivated that work. And then I'll describe the pilot itself, what was built, and the regulatory path that was navigated to get there. And then from there, I'll share what we found in terms of operational performance numbers and environmental and air quality results. And then comes the part that I think that is most relevant to the meeting today, which is how we took these pilot scale findings and built a model to scale them across the entire city, and how would that interact with the city policy and initiatives in that regard. And then I'll close with what it means to policy again, and I'm happy to answer questions during, but I think I heard that they will kept at the end. So please ask questions. So thank you. Yeah. So I'll start with why it matters. Next slide, please. So freight keeps the city running, honestly, but it comes at a real and growing cost. In Canada, freight movement accounts for about 42% of transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, and it's on its track to overtake passenger vehicles as the largest source of emissions by 2030. And this means we can't hit our climate targets without addressing freight specifically. In dense neighborhoods like in downtown Toronto, delivery trucks also compete for scarce curb space, adding congestion and real safety risk to cyclists and pedestrians. And the pressure is only increasing because e-commerce demand has nearly tripled since 2017 in Canada, or like in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area specifically. So pushing more delivery trips into exactly the neighborhoods that are least equipped to absorb that kind of demand. So what's less visible as well is the demand on the people doing the driving. So our research found that actually pollutant levels inside the cabin of the vehicle is higher than that outside of the vehicle, and I'll discuss that even more. Toronto has committed to a 40 to 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And freight has to be a meaningful part of how the city gets to those targets. Next slide. The pilot itself, that's just a backdrop. It's a micro hub and e-cargo tricycles, but in the next slide I'll explain what was actually happening. So again, in partnership with Purelator, we launched this pilot in August 2022. It was centered on the University of Toronto downtown campus, the St. George campus, and it was covering 3 adjacent neighborhoods. At the heart of it was what we call the Urban Quick Stop. That's the Urban Consolidation Center. It's a remodeled shipping container, and it occupies 5 curbside parking spots right on campus. That one small footprint does 3 jobs at the same time. It's a retail pickup and drop-off point for customers. It's a storage space for incoming shipments that come from the terminal centers or distribution centers to be assigned to the delivery vehicles, which are the e-cargo tricycles. And then it also serves as an overnight storage and charging unit for the e-cargo tricycles. Each morning, a truck brings in shipments from the terminal, as I mentioned, to the micro hub. And from there, the tricycles fan out to handle neighborhood level deliveries throughout the city. Each tricycle replaces 1 truck. So each tricycle replaces 1 truck route, I would say. Next slide, please. So to put things into pictures, that's the container. You can see it to the left of the slide, and it serves as a retail spot and a storage unit. There's the truck delivering to the hub, and that's the e-cargo tricycle. If I would want to describe the vehicle type specifically, it's called a rear end cargo heavy pedal pedal-assisted electric tricycle. Now, recently, they've retrofitted kind of a tarp sort of structure around where the cyclist slash driver sits to kind of protect them against the climate elements. But other than that, they still look the same. Next slide, please. Getting to that point where the pilot actually became operational, there wasn't just an operational challenge, there was a regulatory one and a huge one, as a matter of fact. And I think that we always like to include that timeline slide in our presentations because I think it's useful for this meeting. So before 2021, the tricycles of that size, which were needed for meaningful commercial courier operations, simply they weren't allowed on Ontario roads. And that changed in March 2021 when the province legislated a 5-year pilot allowing electric assist tricycles on public roads. Now, the city, Toronto, they opted in later that year into the pilot, but they kept the restrictions that were initially on the weight of the tricycles. So they had a limit of 120 kilograms, which wasn't kind of useful for Purolator because these tricycles are heavier. So, but I think with back and forth and a lot of meetings with the city council, they were convinced that they needed to update their bylaws. And that happened later in that year in December 2021. And the weight class restrictions were removed. It took us another half a year to a year to get an 18 months on-street parking permit because that container had occupied parking spaces. That there was a lot of outcry from the community because you're taking a resource that is scarce already. But the way they did it, there was a food truck pilot happening on the same street. So that was kind of the shortcut way to get the permit. So they say, oh, this is a retail spot. It's similar to these food trucks. And they were allowed to park there and operate at that street using the parking spots. And then operations shortly started after in August 2022. I walked through this timeline because it's a genuine, I think, and repeatable template. Every one of those steps has already been worked out, and there's no reason that it cannot be worked out for the rest of the city and other cities as well. Next slide, please. So our pilot covered 3 adjacent study areas that are shown in the map over here. They're next to the downtown. The downtown actually is at the center of this. The downtown campus of the university is at the center of this study area. So we have 3 service areas: S1, S2, and S3. S1 is mainly the campus plus some institutional buildings, offices, and residences that are for the university. And then S2 is a low to medium density residential area with ground floor retail. S3 includes a lot of legislative buildings for the province and several affiliated colleges with U of T as well. So to evaluate the performance and sort of the feasibility of the pilot, we drew on 3 data sources: the GPS trajectory data, delivery records, and shipment logs. We also had air quality sensors installed inside and outside the vehicle to measure particulate matter concentrations. The data covered 48 truck tours before the pilot. And then during the pilot, we had 55 tricycle tours plus 78 truck tours because they had retained 1 big truck to manage oversized and heavier shipments or parcels that are just physically the tricycles cannot handle. Next slide, please. So what did we actually find? So I'm going to go over some of the operational and environmental measures that we calculated. Next slide. This is the core operational comparison, and I want to kind of discuss it carefully because it's kind of the foundation for the optimization model, the citywide expansion model that we formulated later. So we're comparing 3 regimes. There's the trucks before the pilot, and then the trucks handling oversized parcels during the pilot, and then the e-cargo tricycles handling the standard deliveries during the pilot. The tricycles covered slightly more distance per day, and that we saw is kind of, it has to do with that, with how the bike lane networks are designed in the city. So they're doing it's not a shortest distance basically compared to just regular vehicles. And then but these tricycles also do stop more. The most telling number actually is the dwelling time, or the parking time, or the service time for those vehicles. The tricycles spent just 7.2 minutes serving one courier stop, versus 17.8 minutes for the trucks. You can see also the truck that is doing the oversized parcels, the dwell time also dropped. Now, to be honest, the tricycle did serve, they did deliver less parcels and serve less customers, but that can be explained by, one, there are oversized parcels that are being taken care of by another truck, and two, the fact is they do more courier stops. Each stop is smaller than those of trucks. So because they park, as you can see from the walking distance, they park closer to their customers. So what could have been with the truck one stop that is serving more customers now is broken into 2 or 3 stops for the tricycle. So I don't think we're jeopardizing on the operational efficiency here. It's just an operational logistic difference between the vehicles. Next slide, please. Now, I think an important quantifiable payoff from that replacement has to do with emissions. So based on the MOVE model emissions, the estimates for our study area show that a single delivery truck emits somewhere between 10.5 and 13 kilograms of greenhouse gases per day from that's just a tailpipe emissions. So if you scale this up to a year of operating days, that's roughly around 3 tons of greenhouse gas emissions eliminated annually for every single truck route that is replaced by an e-cargo tricycle. A number that scales, I would say, linearly if we add more tricycles, which is basically the motivation for our citywide expansion model. Next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we also looked at what the truck drivers themselves are exposed to, since that's a dimension that's often overlooked in freight research and practice. So we measured fine particulate matter, PM2.5, both inside the cabin and outside the vehicle, so concurrently, for 41 days of operation. The difference was statistically significant and frankly striking. So in-cabin concentrations were consistently higher than what was measured just outside the vehicle. So in practical terms, like a truck driver working a full shift is breathing more polluted air than the pedestrian on the sidewalk. With e-cargo tricycles, that is pretty much eliminated. Because there's no enclosed cabin trapping exhaust or recirculated air in the vehicle. Next slide, please. So now we have kind of some, I would say, evidence that the pilot clearly works. So the natural next question for us, can we scale this beyond 3 tricycles and the 1 neighborhood that we saw? Next slide. So to answer that question sort of rigorously, we built a formal optimization model to scale this concept citywide. The approach follows 4 steps. First, we start from the parameters that we actually observed in the pilot, real measured tricycle range and how much volume a single microhub with 3 tricycles can handle in a day. Second, we map out the full shipment demand for the year 2023 across all 597 traffic analysis zones in Toronto. So we assume these are our service areas. Third, we solve for basically the number and location of microhubs, which translates into the fleet size, with the objective of minimizing the total cost, the total system cost, given the demand and some capacity constraints that I will talk about in the next slide. And finally, we stress test those results against different assumptions about the capacity, range, and cost, which I will return to shortly. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a moment on what minimizing the total cost actually means here, because I want to open up that black box a little for the audience. So we're minimizing 2 cost components together: the cost of opening and operating the microhub and the cost of the delivery tours the tricycles run out of that hub. So importantly, this isn't picking from a pre-selected short list of sites or candidate sites. The model actually solves simultaneously across all 597 zones. So every zone could be a genuine candidate for the solution. 3 constraints keep it grounded in reality. I think the average neighborhood zone is assigned to exactly 1 microhub, matching how the courier company actually conducts its work. And then a microhub cannot be assigned more parcel volume than what the 3 tricycles can handle. So it matches the capacity, and we we gauge that number from the field, from the pilot. And no delivery tour can exceed a tricycle's single charge range, which is about 8 to 9 hours of continuous driving. Again, these are from the pilot observations. The tour lengths themselves are estimated using well-established methods from the logistics literature, but it's calibrated for the local environment using a proportionality constant. And believe it or not, we have just a scientific publication just on that part of the project. Next slide, please. So the demand side of the model is built on a full year. That was 2023, as I mentioned, a full year of shipment data from our courier partner. They were aggregated across the traffic analysis zone, and the daily demand runs between, I'd say, 10,000 to 25,000 shipments across the first 3 quarters of the year. But then there's a clear peak in the 4th quarter due to the holidays. Demand is heavily concentrated in downtown, and you can see in the map over here, these are the darker shades in the middle of the map. That's where the downtown is. Now, when we sized our solutions, or when we were solving for the solution, we deliberately sized the model to the 95th percentile weekday demand, so that that is the demand that 95% of the time will not be exceeded. So it's I would say a conservatively realistic busy day, so the results can reflect a system that can actually handle real world peak conditions. Next slide, please. Now, onto the results. Solving the model produces a citywide network of 79 microhubs, or 79 urban quick stops. 11 are located in downtown. These are the one in the middle. Most of them are colored red. And then 68 are spread out across the inner urban area of the city. The total number of tricycles would be 237. That's 3 tricycles per microhub. The map shows where these hubs are located in which zones. The red dots actually mark the hubs that are projected to operate at 50% capacity or higher. And you can see immediately that they cluster downtown, which sets up the next slide nicely. So the next slide, please. The downtown clustering shows up clearly in the numbers. So downtown, 10 out of the 11, like 91% of the hubs are projected to operate at high utilization, higher than 50%. And you can see that the service area for each microhub, the catchment area for that hub, is 0.36 square kilometers. I realize now that maybe I should have included the units in miles, but we're just more used to metric measurement units. And then comparing to the microhubs that are spread out across the rest of the city, we need 68 microhubs. Only 24% of them are operating at a higher utilization rate, and each hub serves a bigger area of 1.19 square kilometers. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's important to just get a bit of a idea about the sensitivity analysis that we did. We kind of wanted to check how robust the model is to the assumptions and parameters. So we did some sensitivity on the model's parameters, as I said, and these are mainly the cost, the tricycle, the capacity of the microhub, the size of the microhub, and the cost. So whether we're operating a 3 tricycle hub or a 6 tricycle hub, as well as the cost of setting up the hub itself. So we can see in downtown that the problem is actually more capacity constrained. So doubling the number of tricycles per microhub from 3 to 6 drops the count of the hubs from 11 to 7. But if you increase the cost, it's not going to change. You're still going to need 11 microhubs. When you go to the inner urban area, now it becomes a more of a cost constrained problem. So really changing the capacity of the microhub, if you're having 6 tricycles instead of 3, that does not really change how much microhubs you need. What actually affects the result is the cost of the microhub. So if it's more expensive to build a microhub, the number is naturally going to go down. So this actually proves what we just saw from earlier from the results, that the capacity limits matter more where the demand is dense, and the cost matters more where the demand is thin, or like less dense. And you can see that the downtown is an area that should be targeted first, because the payoff for these microhubs would be faster. Next slide, please. So what does that mean for the city policy and where do we go from there. But before that, we wanted to show you some, like there's a planning tool, an interactive planning tool that my colleague Usman Ahmed developed. This is the same engine that is behind the model for the Toronto, but we applied it on New York City. So it helps you size the micro hub, determine the locations, assign service areas, and determine the number of tricycles as well as the routing for these tricycles. So happy to share that link for anybody who wants to check that tool. This is just a snapshot of the video. I didn't want the slides to be heavy in size, so you're all encouraged to go check that tool out. So you can change the parameters based on the local context, and then it would basically give you some information of what are like good locations for similar micro hubs. Next slide, please. So the way forward has to do with what do we want the city to take from that pilot. So next slide, please. A few things that the city can consider. It's first to dedicate more curbside or off-street space for these micro hubs in high demand areas. So I think in Toronto, the one that we worked on was located on 5 parking spots. There's another one in downtown that is located in an empty parking lot that is underutilized most of the time. Another one is placed in a park and ride station, like a regional train station. So there are good candidates for locations for these micro hubs. And think also, second, there needs to be some thought put into how can we upgrade and update the cycling infrastructure with these tricycles specifically in mind. They need more width and more continuity compared to like the regular bikes, but also you need to consider in terms of the regulatory context, like how will they interact with other users of that bike lane to maintain safety and convenience for all. And then third, these micro hub space requirements should be developed. It should be built into the development approvals, I would say, for major projects, because the city won't be retrofitting that later on. Fourth, incentives like low or zero emission delivery zones can accelerate courier adoption from other companies. And finally, you can prioritize, as I said earlier, the downtown and other high density areas first, since they pay off fastest. Next slide. So to bring this together, I think e-cargo tricycles can replace delivery trucks 1 for 1 in dense neighborhoods without compromising on delivery or operational efficiency. Each truck we replace eliminates around 3 tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year and removes the driver exposure to in-cabin air pollution. At the city scale, we saw that we need 79 well-placed microhubs, which would give us 237 e-cargo tricycles, which would serve the 95th percentile of weekday demand across the city. The demand density and not the battery range or the capacity of the tricycle itself determines where the investment pays off first, and that is downtown. And critically, this isn't like a hypothetical pilot. The provincial legislation, the municipal bylaws, and the on-street permit, and what we already saw from the pilot unfolding on the ground already got us through one working microhub, and the path can be walked again in a similar context. Next slide. I think the next steps for us are refining the model, handle oversized shipments as well as standard parcels. We wanted to include some multi-day demand variation, like maybe produce models that spit out results across different time windows of the day. We're also exploring if we can apply some sort of shared micro hub across different courier companies, like in lower demand areas, so different companies can share the same infrastructure or distribution network. And most, I would say, relevant to the meeting, we are basically in continuous conversation with the city on how the curbside and off-street micro hub locations can be designed or managed, and we hope that they work with us on a second pilot site or a second phase for that pilot. I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much for that. Like I said, we're going to hold questions till the end, and we're going to move on to our final presenters, Dr. Allison Conway and Dr. Branislav Dmitrievich. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good afternoon, everyone. We are both Alice and I are excited to present, I guess, our first presentation of this new project that is just about to kick off. And very happy to actually present, with the backdrop of these two excellent presentations, from Dr. Della Chiara and Dr. Ghisavi. We will be looking at e-commerce delivery mitigation strategies that may apply or may help mitigate some of the negative effects of increasing e-commerce activity in urban neighborhoods, which we are already seeing in NJTPA region. And we can, learning from the recent history, we can expect these to just increase in size and severity in some cases. So I think it's a good time to actually learn from experiences elsewhere, and also maybe come up with some new innovative solutions that we can apply to NJTPA region. Next slide. As I mentioned, and I think Professor Dr. Ghisavi also mentioned, e-commerce is growing. Unlike in Canada, right? Maybe not so fast. These are some of the numbers that Alison pulled up from US Census, and you can see that over the past 9 years, nationwide, e-commerce share in the overall retail sales doubled. Went from about 8.5% in 2017 to about 16-17% in the first quarter of 2026. It's quite a big jump, and we can expect this to keep increasing. What this does to our streets and our neighborhoods is essentially increasing number of packages and deliveries delivered to the doorsteps. And these doorsteps could be in suburban areas where maybe these deliveries and trucks that deliver the packages can actually be accommodated on the curbside, but also includes neighborhoods where it's much more difficult to actually make stops and deliver or handle a large amount of packages per stop. And you can see in some of the pictures illustrations of these situations. Next slide, please. Of course, this comes with some cost, as Dr. Ghisavi mentioned. Number one, in urban neighborhoods, densely populated with streets that are already busy, these deliveries cause extra congestion, and this leads to compromised mobility, increased travel times, number of stops that other vehicles have to make, navigating around the trucks, navigating around the packages being unloaded and offloaded from the delivery vehicles and onto the curb. This also compromises traffic safety, not only for the motorists, but especially for vulnerable road users, bicyclists, and pedestrians. Maybe sometimes visibility is not there. Sometimes the driver behavior is not appropriate, but all of it really just deteriorates safety for everyone, all the road users. Compromise air quality, number of stops increasing, acceleration, deceleration cycles increasing, idling. It all leads to increase in emissions. Even with electrification of our fleets, this is still becoming an increasing problem in urban neighborhoods. Inefficient and unsafe curb usage also, obviously with these packages being handled on the curbside or right next to the curbside. It's also the question is also how do we manage this space that already is scarce in urban neighborhoods, and make it more efficient for everyone actually involved, and all the users, and not just those who are traveling by foot, on bicycles, or in vehicles, but also people, residents in the neighborhoods where deliveries are made, as well as commercial outfits, as well as office space. This also, of course, affects the freight and delivery operations, longer times, finding a spot where to park. Dwell times are increasing. Congestion also leads to longer travel times between stops. So all of it just kind of makes everything inefficient. And of course, quality of life for those who are facing, these packages and boxes being assembled and, handled in the curbside, trying to navigate around these operations and activities. It just makes everyday life and, going about your life and errands much more difficult. So all of these challenges essentially are the main reason why NJTPA came up with the idea to look into this issue, as well as find a way to mitigate the negative effects of increasing urban deliveries and increasing e-commerce, and seeing this as something that is going to increase, as I said, as a challenge, as a difficulty. It's a good time to actually look at some of the mitigation strategies that we can implement in our urban neighborhoods. Next slide. So some of the mitigation strategies, and both Professor Della Chiara and Dr. Ghisavi mentioned some of these and kind of illustrated some success stories from around the world, as well as from Toronto most recently. But some of them, I guess many of them work, but they don't work always, and they don't work at every location. So the context of the location, the context of the urban deliveries, the context of demand, the context of land use, the context of infrastructure, and available curb space are all going to dictate what kind of strategies would be appropriate, what kind of strategy would be feasible, and what is most important to us, which one would be most effective for a given location. So our study is going to look at all of these different strategies, right? And try to find a good fit between different strategies, different solutions, and locations where we think these problems with urban deliveries, e-commerce deliveries, will become most severe. We'll look at on-street micro-hubs, off-street micro-hubs. Off-street micro-hubs could be in some locations such as this, which is enclosed, but it could be an open parking lot, or some other space that could be retrofitted to accommodate, package, reshuffling the packages and kind of sorting them by delivery location in the nearby neighborhood. Parcel lockers, which is essentially most like more of a self-served pickup, while delivery into the locker is made by delivery vehicles themselves, and then how deliveries are actually made from the hub, from the micro hub to the customers, using more sustainable, eco-friendly, but also urban neighborhood-friendly vehicles such as bicycles, tricycles, some of the carts. And then policies, like Dr. Ghisavi mentioned, for curb usage are also helpful. Figuring out the best way to regulate the usage of curb, maybe regulated during different times of day, maybe for different types of deliveries, different types of vehicles, accommodating the activities that would best fit the neighborhood, but also be most efficient and most effective, or most effective in addressing some of those challenges that we mentioned before. Next slide. So our study essentially started with these issues, problems, and anticipated increase in severity of these issues and problems, especially in our urban neighborhoods. And we kind of set these four objectives for the study. Number one, obviously review the best practices from elsewhere. There's been a lot of work over the past decade, figuring out the best ways to find solutions and strategies to address increasing urban deliveries. So Alison has done a lot of work already, and we are kind of I'm lucky to partner with her in this study. but clearly there's been some recent developments that we really want to look at and learn from those. Number two, we want to identify strategies that would be addressing those issues that I mentioned before, problems and challenges for our neighborhoods, and also describe how those strategies would work. What are some of the, I guess, requirements and constraints that have to be considered when I guess considering a strategy for a specific neighborhood, which again comes with certain characteristics and properties. Then once we have a good idea of what strategies are available, what technologies, maybe new practices that and innovative approaches can be applied, once we can have a good understanding of how those would work in different settings, we would like to locate some of the areas in the NJTPA region. Mostly will probably be in urban, densely populated neighborhoods, where these mitigation strategies will be most successful. First and foremost, from the perspective of mitigating the negative effects of urban deliveries. And then lastly, we plan to develop a concept and an action plan that would actually help us implement these strategies in these candidate locations. And this will obviously require, and we plan to have a very extensive engagement with local communities and stakeholders, because this, as mentioned earlier, requires a lot of participants in the process to work together and come up with strategies and plans to effectively implement these innovative solutions for urban deliveries. I will now give floor to my colleague, Alison Conway. Alison will walk us through the work plan and some of the early work that we've done already, as we kind of launch this study.
Thanks, Branislav. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through every bullet point on the slide, but essentially we have 7 tasks for the study. Obviously, overseeing the entire extent of the study, we'll be working with a technical advisory committee. And I will discuss in detail the types of outreach we're going to do on the last slide. And so essentially our workflow, we're going to start with the best practices review. And actually, could you go to the next slide? And then we'll come back to this one. So the best practices review is essentially a review of US and international case studies. So looking into all of the solutions that you saw on that mitigation strategy slide, and learning from the work of our previous speakers, both Giacomo and Farah have presented examples of exactly what we're looking at from other cities. So we'll be looking both at academic studies as well as agency reports from pilot studies and other MPOs, for example, that have looked at similar questions. We will also be conducting, as part of our best practices review, so in that first stage of the project, stakeholder interviews with the stakeholders in locations where these strategies have actually been implemented. And those would be the operators as well as the public agencies that have actually implemented these solutions. From our previous speakers, you've already heard about a lot of these characteristics that we're going to be looking at. There is no one-size-fits-all solution for any city logistics strategy, but especially when it comes to e-commerce. But we'll be looking at what is the infrastructure required, what are the characteristics of commodities that are effectively moved using these mitigation strategies, what are the types of vehicles involved, and what are the business models? So how are they organized and who is actually involved in the organization? Looking at something Farah kind of hinted at, understanding not just sort of urban density, but actually the market density of how dense the parcel deliveries are in given environments. The built environment, so looking at traffic conditions and physical infrastructure in places where these solutions have been successfully implemented. Regulatory environments, I think across our 3 previous speakers, we've heard references to vehicle operating regulations, curb regulations, zoning regulations, all of which can affect not only the success of these solutions, but even their feasibility. We especially want to look at the stakeholders involved and their stakeholder-specific roles. Often in city logistics, when we have top-down approaches where we're not engaging the right industry stakeholders, those strategies fail before they're even started. And so we want to make sure that we identify who are the right stakeholders to actually move these solutions forward. And then finally, looking at the performance metrics, what works, what hasn't worked, and what were the factors that caused those successes and failures, and how do we actually measure them? If you can go back to the previous slide. So best practices review, then task 4 will be to evaluate the existing conditions and identify locations where we expect mitigation would be helpful and successful. So we want to identify those locations most in need of these e-commerce mitigations. And then from there, we will actually identify specific strategies and conduct stakeholder outreach to those communities. Again, I'll come back to that point in a few minutes. And then task 6 will be to actually develop these concepts in detail and put together essentially a implementation plan of how we can actually move forward with these mitigation strategies, and then publishing that in a final report. So if you can go ahead 2 slides. So as part of our that location analysis, we'll be relying on several best available data sources. So the key data sources that we'll be using, so Nielsen IQ data, which is a data set that's been used in a number of prior NJTPA freight studies, which helps us to understand the actual demand for parcel delivery. So understanding which zip codes are generating demand for package delivery. And then we have our US Census products, US Census data that we can use to actually develop models to understand what are those factors that are generating the demand for packages in specific locations. The map that you're looking at on your screen is actually a map that was put together by 2 Brooklyn Tech high school students who were working with me this summer, as well as my PhD student, so Alex Wolfowitz, Moses Dodd, and Fatima Rezapour Fardin. This is some mapping we did just conceptually using census data, and the students really took the lead on developing this based on our prior research in understanding the demand factors for parcel delivery. Once we have our Nielsen IQ data, we can actually refine these models. This is just conceptual as of right now. We can actually refine those to do different types of analyses to understand where different types of demand might exist. And then the other major data source we'll be working with in this project is Geotab, and particularly Geotab's Altitude platform, which is a totally different data set. That's going to provide us information about the actual vehicle movements that are completing these parcel deliveries. So we'll going to, from the Geotab data, explore the actual vehicle movements and the parking activity that are occurring in these locations where we expect that there's high demand, so that we can actually understand those kind of before conditions of where the most challenging locations for e-commerce delivery are. So next slide. As I've already mentioned a couple times in this presentation, a really key part of this study is going to be ongoing stakeholder engagement. First with the technical advisory committee that's going to be overseeing the full extent of the project. The best practices review will be interviewing those who have actually implemented these solutions in other cities to learn, again, not only best practices, but also about the challenges that might be faced in implementing these solutions and identifying those success factors and barriers. The strategy development, stakeholder outreach, once we have an idea of which strategies we expect might be effective based on those local conditions that we've identified and our best practices review, we will conduct local community outreach to the communities where we think that some of these solutions might be effective, because we also recognize that data is not going to identify every local condition that may affect whether or not this is a good solution. So we want to conduct extensive outreach into those local communities, as well as at that point actually starting to talk to the types of operators who may actually be providing services or technologies to actually implement these solutions locally in the NJTPA region. And then finally, our strategy concept development, once we've sort of narrowed in on and fully developed which types of solutions make the most sense within the NJTPA region, to actually, again, hold those concept review meetings with municipalities or local community representatives for those proposed areas to get feedback and to help us refine what an implementation plan might look like. So next slide. So this just gives us a general overview of the study schedule. As you can see, we are just getting started, kicking off this project right now. Our best practices review is ongoing, so we have started looking at all of the solutions that you saw on the screen and putting together that comprehensive review of best practices. Within the next couple of months, we'll be starting the location evaluation using those data sets. And then over the course of the next calendar year is when we will really develop those strategies, fully develop the concept, and publish our final report. So last slide. So that's our general overview of what we'll be undertaking over the next 17 or 18 months. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy, Branislav and I are happy to take any questions as well as the other speakers.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a tremendous amount of information from all speakers. I mean, it's an amazing, what a changing, rapidly changing environment this is that we are dealing with. So at this point, Sophia, you're going to manage questions and answers. I don't see anything in the chat at this moment.
Yeah, I'll start off with some questions I had while people make
Okay, great.
in their chats. So I have a question for Giacomo, which is, have any of the cities that you measured or that you looked at, have any of them measured their success of their loading zones? Or is that, another location where data might be missing?
I would say like cities have different way to measure success and quantify that. Whether that is done through proper study or evaluation, and then it's published online is very different. So our focus on the review is really like not saying what works, what doesn't work. Like was more like what cities are doing. We were not able to find really anything, but we're also not really fully looking like, is that approach working or working better than others. The other thing is that we didn't really want it to include pilots or experimentations. We really included like the day-to-day activities, policies and regulation that those cities are doing. So yeah, it was not the objective of our work at this point to really evaluate and say what worked or what didn't work, but also just looking those, we don't really have any good standard way to say those programs works better than another.
And then I had a follow-up question was, I think you mentioned that the penalties in Europe were higher than the United States. Is that correct, or how does that work?
Oh yeah, I mean, CCTV is much more used. I think I've seen recently, like only Philadelphia, they start like automated enforcement, for instance. When I was living and working in Singapore, their regulation was very strict and the use of CCTV was very high. In Japan as well, for instance, I have a colleague from Japan. We're doing a study together. Basically, there are like hundreds and hundreds of micro hubs there in Tokyo. And one of the reasons was because the regulation is so strict in terms of not like monetary penalties, but we're talking about like drivers losing their license if they park unauthorized places. So those affect, of course, there some I'm not. It really depends on the context, right? But in Europe, a lot they use like a point system where you lose your license after X number of losing X number of points. I'm not suggesting this to be applied here, but in terms of like enforcement, it's pretty basic here in the US in terms of like use of technology for that or monitoring activities.
Does anyone on the call want to unmute and ask a question to Giacomo? All right, I've got some questions for can you explain more about the partnership between Purolator and the City of Toronto and how that kicked off and how finances worked and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the question. I can explain how it came about. I don't know much about the cause. I know a little about it, but because we are the third party in the collaboration, so we are the research team basically that did all of the feasibility studies and all that to kind of make a case for Purolator with the city council. So what happened first is that Purolator were lobbying. They had that idea for some sort of electrified tricycles for deliveries in Toronto for a while. I think they started negotiating with the city during COVID. But there was an issue with the regulations with the province before the city. So these specific model of tricycles with that weight class were not permitted on the roads. So I am not sure Purolator had any lobbying effect on the province in terms of why they decided to legislate a 5-year pilot. It could have been the case, but I'm not sure, so I cannot say. But they around the same time, the city also came with, okay, the province said, okay, let's do a 5-year pilot and see which cities in Ontario want to opt out. We're going to remove all the restrictions on these vehicle types, and then it goes basically it's up to each city to see how they want to take that pilot. And so there was active kind of lobbying with the city council before I joined the project. I would say in the preparatory phases, Dr. Matthew Ruda had attended a lot of city council meetings where they were making the case not only for electric cargo cycles, but also for, at the time, person following autonomous, semi-autonomous delivery robots. They were also talking about just general electrified electric trucks. And the city picked up on that idea of the electric cargo tricycles, and they started going through the studies on changing and updating their bylaws. So the first they opted into the pilot with the province. So now, okay, we're allowing these tricycles in, but they had issues with the weight restriction because the regulation where the bike lane usage is concerned is not clear. So it's not illegal, but it's just not regulated. And there's a difference between these two terms here. So then, okay, they regulated it. They removed the weight class restriction. The bikes were brought in. They were approved by the city. Purolator put in some tests on the operation. And then we started the process. Okay, where do we locate this micro hub? Because we were the research team involved and we are located in downtown Toronto, we decided, okay, it makes sense, I mean, demand-wise, to start with downtown because it's just higher demand in these areas, but also because of the convenience of the location. So they lobbied with the city to basically get a parking permit for on-street parking along with the food trucks. So they kind of argued that we are similar in a retail, in a commercial sense. So why not opt in with that same permit? So they did, and they got it for 18 months. But I think now it's, I think since August 2024, it has become a permanent, it's a permanent location for that micro hub. Operations shortly started afterward. In terms of the cost, it's completely funded and handled by Purolator, operationally and installation. There was an issue with power connections. So because it's an on-street parking, we worked with the university itself to kind of supply electricity or power from nearby buildings. So I'm not sure how that cost is handled between the university and the Purolator, but I know the source is through the university buildings. And yeah, I think that's about it. And then we received funding as a research group from the city, just like a regular grant funding. And we also received grant funding from Purolator to conduct that research. They did provide some data. We also brought in some of our devices for air quality. We put some telematic devices on the electric cargo tricycles as well. So I hope that answers your question, even if not fully, but partially.
It does, thank you. And you got a question in the chat asking about tricycles versus delivery trucks.
Okay, so now I would say a significant portion of the trucks that are deployed by Purolator are electric, hybrid or fully electric. The reason why they went for electric cargo tricycles, it's because they're just, for them, it was I think they were going for it's a nicer idea. It's more promotable. There's that aspect, the PR aspect of it also. But we found operationally that the trucks were running at half capacity most days of the year, except in the fourth quarter where there's a peak in the demand. So capacity wise and demand wise, you really did not need trucks, like the capacity of the trucks. So they opted for the tricycles, and there had been some pilots in Montreal, the same sort of pilots by FedEx and by Purolator. So I think their natural next step was trying it out in Toronto.
You've got another question here. You're on a roll. Is for national regulation rules for cargo bikes in Canada?
I'm not sure, nationally across the whole country, but I do know that Quebec and Ontario have those regulations worked out already. There's recently British Columbia launched something similar. I think it's legislatively, I think it's up to each province. It's not a federal thing, I think, but it has to, the reasons why the provinces are opting in their own similar pilots is because they are required to do stuff to reach the emission reduction targets. So, and this is one way to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move on to questions to Allison and Bronislav. The first one is, will there be any exploration holistically looking at competitive curb space pricing across all types of potential users be explored in the NJTPA study? And I could also chime in if need.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try first. We just to kind of be direct, we have not specifically discussed this yet. I don't think that the scope will have enough time to actually holistically look at this. Holistically, I guess I understand this as a not just concept, but also from the policy point of view and then the implementation point of view. But as a concept of not pricing, but costing out, because any implementation would include some level of cost for both the operators, but also for the local community. That probably will be tied to the use of curb space one way or the other. So from that context, I think that will become a part of our study. But specifically pricing out the usage of space, I don't think we'll have enough time actually to only focus on that, given the scope of the oral study. But please, Sophia and Allison, chime in.
That sounds right.
Yeah, I would say that we're looking at what strategies are out there that are specifically managing curb space where we expect e-commerce demand, some of which, like Giacomo covered, permits, the micro hubs in New York City, that is a priced permit to operate a micro hub in New York City. But the actual economics behind what should the price of that permit be, or what should an hourly toll be to promote vehicle turnover is not probably within the scope of the study.
And then another question is, in the selection and consideration of strategies, are you considering in-transit freight vehicles versus stopping and parking?
Yes, in fact, I think Alison can actually provide more detail, but we plan to use Altitude platform to actually analyze and evaluate the vehicle behavior and the stops and the duration of stops, in fact, in these neighborhoods where we think these strategy would probably be most effective.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of the Geotab data is that Geotab actually has a couple of metrics that allow us to look at like the tour behavior of the vehicle, not just the like location specific parking. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I see no other questions.
Yeah, I was going to say it's thank you very much for that. Yeah, we're running up on an hour and a half, so I want to try to wrap this up. Once again, thank you so much to all of our speakers, especially having to work your way in from Canada. Appreciate that work around there, and a lot of interesting information in a very quickly evolving subject.